Hey everyone, so I'm Nick and I'm an open source maintainer.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeff. I'm also an open source maintainer.
And collectively, we're jerks. Okay, kidding aside, this is a topic that we're particularly passionate about. We are both open source maintainers, so that gives us a little bit of credibility in terms of starting this conversation. It's not an endpoint, it's not really you must go and do this. We've got some calls to actions at the end. But it's really about starting the conversation for those who don't contribute to open source software and continuing that conversation for people who already are contributing to open source software. So we'll actually do proper intros now. So my name's Nick Randolph. I run a consulting company called Built to Roam. We do cross-platform apps and services in the cloud, just like every other consulting company out there. And well, come on, let's be real about this. I contribute actively to a project called MVM Cross, and I guess my history there is I saw this as something that I wanted to give back, a project that's contributed so much to the projects that I deliver for my customers.
Hi, I'm Geoff Huntley. I'm an open source software engineer. I'm a maintainer of an open source project called Reactive UI. It's very, very similar to MVM Cross. We interface quite a lot with line of business software developers. And I got involved with open source development 5 years ago for my personal development and growth.
And we're not just really good friends, it's actually because the camera site means that we need to sit to this side of there, otherwise I'd be out here. But, okay, so the agenda for today is we're going to spend a bit of time looking at why people and companies should contribute back to open source. And we'll talk about how they can actually contribute, and then we'll wrap it up and talk a little bit more about how much should one contribute? Because it's all very well to say, yeah, I should contribute, and once a year you go and log a ticket. It's like, that's not contributing, right? Yeah. So how much should you contribute back to an open source project? We're going to start off with a bit of a breakdown as to why individually we contribute. So I'll hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, Nick. So 5 years ago, I was working at an enterprise company, and I kind of hit the upper limit of my personal growth. I looked around locally, and I couldn't find any mentors. And it turns out open source is a fantastic way to get like 5 years of growth in like a single year. You start off just doing the most mundane thing, and all of a sudden there's no one else to fix that thing, so you got to learn that thing, and then you fix that thing, and now you're mentoring people how to fix that thing. And I really got involved with open source is to just build my professional network, and I've succeeded in this in many ways. But I've also built a lot of friends. At its core, open source is mates trading favors with mates, and that's what open source is. So fantastic. If you haven't got involved with open source, I highly recommend that you do. It's a fantastic avenue for open source. Traditionally, if you wanted to go build a bridge, like in a normal industry, you need supply, materials, planning, and approval. You don't have this in software engineering. If you want to go build that software bridge, you can. You can go hang out with the maintainers of SQLite and learn from them exactly how to build a database. Open source is a really good opportunity for your personal development.
And from a business perspective, the value proposition of open source is very clear, right? I can go out into any sort of package repository and pull down things that a whole host of people have been contributing up. But then the risk associated with it comes to light because, as a company, I'm going, okay, well, I'm building all of this stuff for my customers, but what am I basing it on? Or what's the foundation of that? And so, there's a whole host of reasons why people say, hey, you should contribute to open source software. These are all quite dated now in the sense that they've been around for a while. People understand that, I might have a component that we built internally that I release on open source so that other people can use it. And, that does a couple of things. It, boosts my PR for the company and basically says, hey, I'm contributing back to the community. It also means that other people outside the business can actually contribute back to it and I get extra value out of it. But the missing thing out of all of these, and I don't expect you to read them, is the fact that underlying this is this thing called a software supply chain, right? And the chain of an open source project contributing to the projects that I work for a customer. If that supply chain disappears or changes, I'm left carrying the baby. Okay, I'm the one who has to work out. Okay, well, how do I service my customers going forward? And so I need to do a bit of a retrospective and go, okay, well, how do I protect that software supply chain? Before we go on, let's actually stop and take a bit of a back step and actually look at what open source software actually is.
So open source software, in essence, is mates trading favors with mates. It's the hacker spirit. But technically, the word open source is a trademark. It was an initiative created 20 years ago, And this trademark has a rules of usage on this trademark, and they specifically list an open source license isn't open source unless it has the following freedoms. And these guidelines were designed around the freedoms of consumption and releasing the maintainers of liability for their creations. And like in 2000, proprietary software was the enemy. That was 20 years ago now. Like proprietary software was the enemy. But like now, 20 years on, like 2018, like open source is won. Companies are using open source software by default. People choose open source over proprietary software. And like maybe the narrative needs to change. Now we maybe need to reinspect this. Did we get it right? Or is it wrong? Like what is working, what is not working?
I think that's a good point because, I mean, fundamentally open source, the way it is these days, is really mates trading favors with mates. It's a voluntary thing. You know, one project might contribute to another and vice versa. So, you know, there is a bit of this sort of trading favors. And so that kind of goes, okay, well, if it's voluntary, doesn't this lead to problems? You know?
Yeah, and like, because we've defined open source in the terms of freedom for consumers, we haven't really thought about like, if that was right. We never really thought about the cost of maintenance and supporting those that you build upon. And a good example in the industry that's occurred is Heartbleed. Heartbleed is a classic example of this problem. It happened a couple of years ago. And in essence, what we had was a couple open source software developers, an entire industry, the entire software industry built upon this SSL library. And we had a security issue in this library and it caused billions of dollars worth of damage. And whilst they did have some revenue for this project, it turns out that the companies were only paying them to add new features. No one was paying them to resolve technical debt. And this is just a prime example of the problems that happen if you don't support your software supply chain. This is billions of dollars worth of damage that happened in our industry that could have been avoided.
And then the other side of this is really, okay, we've talked about what happens if there are actual issues with the deliverables of a project, but what happens if the project stops getting maintained? What happens if it goes away completely? I mean, who's left carrying the baby, so to speak? And that's a problem that's hard to quantify and actually very difficult to find a solution to, right?
So the key is, like, open source is as is. Like, it's in the license. We don't owe you anything. Maintainers of the software, as soon as we release that software to the world, that's where our responsibilities end. We do not need to respond to GitHub issues. They don't need to create documentations, don't need to answer questions on Stack Overflow. Releasing software is where the obligation of maintainers end. Anything past that point is they're going over and above a level of service. And people seem to have forgotten this. It's covered in the open source licenses. The software is as is. But
surely this means that, well, maintainers are sort of like a bit of like vendors, really, in the sense that they're producing software that other people are using. But again, aren't we running into this problem where, you know, there's this expectation on maintainers to live up to some form of unreasonable SLA?
Yeah, so open source software maintainers are vendors. They're unpaid vendors, and they're held to an SLA when there is no SLA.
And so industry-wide, this is a huge problem, right? This is a report by Sonatype that looks at, in this particular case, it's the Java and JavaScript repositories. But you can just see the astronomical growth that there's been over the last couple of years in terms of the repository itself. And so, you know, this is a big problem, and, you know, if we don't address it as an industry, then it's going to cause us ramifications going forward.
This is actually $1 billion problem. Here's a quote left on GitHub last year. And it was a comment. It was like, I don't want to target .NET 4. I have to target .NET 4. My company runs $1 billion business with commercial software that is not compatible with later versions of .NET. I have no power to change this. The lack of support for .NET 4 is killing me.
And this is actually quite common. You know, if you've ever maintained a project, you'll get people who raise issues and says, what about me? I have this particular requirement, I need it solved, and I don't want it done now. And if you don't respond to it or leave it open or it doesn't get any traction, they'll come back and they'll post against it and they'll post against it. And virtually every project I've seen, maintainers at some point will jump in and address this type of a thing, right?
And like the maintainer of this project, replied with, like, point me to one significant contribution your billion-dollar company has made to any open source project in the last month, and I'll support .NET 4. Now, as a reminder, .NET 4 came out in 2009, right? This keeps me up at night. Why are companies uploading their company's problems onto unpaid volunteers? And like Simon Kropp, the maintainer, had very similar concerns. Like, he's just reasserting his rights. Like, I guess the underlying problem in this scenario is you have a problem, your company refuses to keep their software reasonably up to date, and your request for a free open source project, in effect, to keep supporting you, is to make your problem someone else's problem.
And so how did Simon resolve this in the end?
Yeah, so Simon closed off the ticket. Actually, even closed off the GitHub issue. Ticket, that's the thing. People use the word ticket. That's commercial terms.
Yes.
It's a very tricky, open source is very tricky.
Damn Jira users.
Yeah, so he closed it off and saying, look, so again, I'm sorry, I'm going to close this. I've updated the documentation, I've updated the minimum specified, but let it be clear, Simon didn't need to do this. By even replying to that GitHub issue, he's doing over and above what he was meant to be doing. Like, he could be spending time with his friends, he could be spending time with his very patient and lovely wife, his 2 dogs, or watching Netflix. Look, the thing that I just don't get is, like, previously companies would have budget, like, for proprietary services, and that budget has evaporated, and now companies are getting services that they would normally pay for free.
And the upshot here is that if you look at the response back from Simon, he's very polite about it, and he's gone about it in a very diplomatic way, and basically said, look, you know, there are various constraints on the project, constraints on the, you know, the contributors and maintainers for their time and their resources. And he's basically saying, look, for the best interest of the project, we can't continue down this path and supporting .NET 4. Yeah. Now, the thing is, that doesn't make him a jerk. That just means that he's focused on the deliverables of the project, right? And I'd go so far as to say that nearly all maintainers are not jerks. They just care more about the project as a whole than any one developer does. And I think we are at a point now where we need to start resetting some expectations. We need to reset expectations for the people consuming open source projects, and we need to reset expectations around the level of contribution that those consumers end up putting back into the project. You know, there's a whole ton of things that we need to consider about, you know, what happens if the project fails? What happens if a key maintainer, you know, burns out? I wouldn't say I've burned out, but definitely if you look at my contribution to GitHub for the last 6 to 9 months, it's been heavily on every month up until September. And basically I got to a point in the beginning of this month where I basically said, right, I've got to focus on some other stuff, right? And so my green bar has gone grey, and it doesn't freak me out, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it's got to the point where I don't feel that I'm in a position where I can contribute on an ongoing basis to MVVM Cross in, you know, for the next month or 2. And so that's an important thing, because now all of a sudden they need to look for other people to support UWP and some of the Xamarin Form stuff that I was previously taking on. Now, by chance, they have actually got a couple of contributors who are now jumping in and fixing that stuff and addressing those. But it means that I can now take a bit of a back step, you know, quite safely, knowing that it's in good hands.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with, like, open source and the terms of it. I think that we just need to add, like, a commons clause that actually talks about specifically protecting the supply chain and preventing situations of tragedy of the commons. I think it's really important to actually grow the definition to more along the lines of community, and move the dialogue past doing a commit. There is more ways to contribute to open source than a commit.
And definitely from the perspective of a project, we need to get beyond, okay, an initial burst of activity around, you know, delivering a version of a project. We actually now need to start thinking of the longevity or the sustainability of a project. And it's not just to, you know, we've got 3 key maintainers, we've got to get that to 5 or 10 or 15. We actually need to think about what that means on an ongoing basis.
And look, there was a talk given by Russell last year at PyCon AU, and it was a fantastic talk. I recommend you go look at it. It was beautiful. And he talks about software supply chains. And the main thing is, like, we've been kind of mum's the word as a software industry about, like, money and open source. Like, it's actually kind of a dirty topic. And we haven't established the conditions where companies can mitigate these risks. How can a company like mitigate these risks in their supply chain? How does an employee go to their manager or to legal and have these conversations? It's been kind of mum's the word about all these type of things, and best practices haven't been developed. And look, open source needs to evolve to consider the cost of maintenance. And if we evolve to the point of considering the cost of maintenance, we get to the point where we're looking at sustainability. And sustainability has a flow-on effect of diversity. The people who can get involved with open source software traditionally are men, 18 to 25 years old, and white Anglo-Saxon males. This is what open source is. And in my case, I'm now 35, I now have 2 kids. I'm having to dial down my involvement in open source. And that means the cycle continues. There's no mentors available to actually teach the younger generations to not make the mistakes that I did. It means that the perspective of open source, if we got to the point where we have sustainability in open source, we can get to the point where we can actually, like, if there's a work-at-home mother, they can do the GitHub issue triage. Like, we could pay them. Like, we can change the face of open source. We got to a level of sustainability.
And so just coming back to looking at how we then protect the supply chain, I think, Jeff's alluded to it before, there's this sort of parallels between what we do in software and what happens in other industries, like, for example, building roads and bridges.
Yeah, so this lady, Nadia Abigail, very interesting lady. I highly suggest that you follow her. She published a report 2 years ago called The Roads and Bridges. And this was done by the Ford Foundation, commissioned for the Ford Foundation out of a grant. We're now starting to see grants coming out and given to people to research complex problems to prevent tragically common situations. And she makes this brilliant analogy that open source software is digital infrastructure, right? It's digital infrastructure. People just like drive on by, they consume it, and it all works fine. But the problem is, in the physical world, what we actually do have is, well, we've got roads and bridges, and we have councils, and councils pay someone to maintain those roads. Who's paying the maintainers of open source software projects? Like, everyone's just driving on the highways, and we're getting potholes everywhere. It's bad. And so she's looking into this, collecting the data. She commissioned this report, moved to GitHub, did a bunch of data science to gather more data on this subject, and she's just continuing on. If you want to get information for your business, go there.
And so as a business, the question then comes out, okay, what do I need to do to secure my supply chain? And so we need to think about, the level of contribution that my business needs to make back into open source, and I guess the options that I have for doing that. And so I guess the next part of this talk, we are going to focus on what a contribution is and how much you should be contributing.
Yeah, so the truth is, free software really isn't free. Like, someone is paying the cost. Like React, that's a subsidized project, right? And what happens when Facebook stops subsidizing that project? The project I maintain, Reactive UI, used to be subsidized by GitHub. They no longer are using that technology, and the community died. And that's where I came in. I came in doing community management and getting involved in open source. That was my personal growth and development. I loved it. But look, if you can't help with money, help with time. And a good example of helping with time is there is an initiative called Open Source Friday, opensourcefriday.com. And the idea is, as an engineering leader, you reserve some time in your sprint. And if you have a 2-week sprint, you reserve 1 day for the personal development of your employees. And the idea here is those employees, during that 20% time, they can pull request and update, they can pull requests and learn how that open source software that they depend upon works. And it means you're having a positive influence in the community. You start attracting people into your company and showing that you contribute back to open source. You build a relationship with the open source maintainer, so if you hit a critical issue in the next sprint, he's more likely to willing to help you because you've already helped him. You're doing the hacker spirit. Really, really important.
But I think you touched on the need to contribute via a commit. And it's like, well, there's a whole bunch of areas, even if you're going to devote time and not money, where you can actually start to contribute without necessarily doing pull requests and commits, right? Because, some projects are harder to get into and take more time to get your head around all of the bells and whistles. but there's always a level that you can contribute, even if you've only got like an hour here or an hour there. And they start with the sort of the dollars right at the top, and then if you look at some of the management side of things, who manages the triage board, who manages what the features are that the developers are working on, who prioritizes fix, who works out how to reproduce issues or bugs. There's a host of things out there that don't result in a commit or a pull request, and yet are just equally valuable to the livelihood of the open source project.
I think it's really important. Just don't contribute just by code. Change your dialogue. And if you hear someone saying, "I can't contribute because I don't know the project," that's horse. Like, they can contribute. It's really simple. There's so many different ways you can contribute. Blog posts, writing blog posts, shipping something onto GitHub, helping out the community. There's so many different ways to contribute. But really, the only form of contribution that's bad is no contribution.
To coin a phrase, that's right. So just touching on this issue of contribution being hard, it is a fundamental problem why developers often don't contribute back to a project. They go, okay, well, I don't know the source code. It would take, it'd be too difficult to contribute. And even if they do know the source code, actually committing a change and getting it through the pull request process can quite often be a daunting task. Quite often there's this sort of fear of failure that developers don't want to go. They don't want to put something in the public that might be criticized or might have to undergo change before it's committed. But I think that one of the things that I'd like to point out is if you find contributing hard, then chances are you're not alone. Chances are there are other people interested in contributing to that project who are stuck because they don't know how or when or why to contribute. So lay some foundations for the next person behind you. Work out how you can make it easy for the next person to contribute to that project. And then over time, it'll get easier and easier for people to contribute. So.
Contributing on developer accessibility is a fantastic thing. It just pays off. The maintainers are continually worried about how I get people into the project. And a lot of people don't communicate their stress and frustration when they're trying to contribute to a project. So if you really want to help out a project and a maintainer, there's a couple of things. Actually signify that you want to help out. Just ask, "I would like to help you out," and then focus on sharing your experiences and your pain in contribution and resolve that. And by doing that, you build up your relationship, and over time, the code can wait. Build your relationship up, focus on developer accessibility, and the code can wait. You can contribute before you read the code.
And so, Jeff, for reactive UI, what are some of the things that you guys have been working on to make it easier for people?
Yeah, so for reactive UI, one of the things we've done is we actually in GitHub have issue tags specifically talking about developer experience, contributor experience, and that's just basically signaling that we care about these things and we label certain things in a particular way. And we've had people just randomly drop on by and say, "I tried to clone this on Visual Studio for Mac and it didn't work." And we go, "Thank you very much for letting us know." And he goes, "Look, I don't even use this software. I just saw that you care about this issue, and here you go. Here's my feedback." We've been incorporating this feedback. We've been looking at, because we support so many platforms, it's very hard for everyone to have a domain knowledge of all the mobile platforms, televisions, watches, and stuff like that. So we divided it up into small little section areas. There's a convention on GitHub called code owners. And code owners allow you to go a file match. Anything in the Android directory goes to the Android review team. And Nick, you've been doing quite a lot with continuous delivery.
Yeah, look, we have, and I think we're a little bit further behind on both the CI and also code owners than, say, reactive UI. But I think one of the areas outside of that, and it's an area where people can engage quite heavily, is we actually have a thing called the playground. And so when you go to the source code for MVM Cross, there's a single solution file that works in Visual Studio sometimes. You open it and there is this playground there. And the playground has a buildable, runnable version of an app for each platform that we support. And we, as the community, so contributors and maintainers, make sure that with each commit and with each pull request, those playgrounds work. And the reason being is that if somebody goes and raises an issue around MVM Cross, the first thing that we'll respond with is, hey, did you know that there's a playground, in the source code that you can actually go and run up? And would you mind going and seeing if you can reproduce it there? Because we know that project works. We use it for all of our development. We know that it end to end pretty much works. And quite often, the person who raised the issue will go, okay, yeah, cool, no worries. And then they'll get to the point where they go, okay, well, I've done that. I can reproduce it there. And now what? And we just turn to them and say, well, just issue a pull request. It's a work in progress pull request. And sure enough, they do it. It appears in the list. And there's no fear of failure because it's already broken. We know it's broken. It says it in the description of the pull request. It's broken, right? And so this whole fear of failure has completely gone away, right? And so then we work progressively with them, either on the pull request itself, or if there's an associated issue, we'll have comment threads going there. Or quite often we'll actually just reach out on Slack or some other forum to actually engage with them to try and resolve it quickly and get it out of the PR list. But this notion of fear of failure is something I encountered when I started work on it. I was going, I don't know whether I should commit this or not. And the reality is there's no bad commit, right? There's commits that get accepted into the project and there's commits that don't, right? Even if your PR is a load of junk and actually doesn't do what it's supposed to, there might be one commit that a maintainer goes, yeah, I like what you've done there. There might be some code formatting or something like that. Yoink, I'll pull that into my next pull request, and all of a sudden we've improved the workflow of the project as a whole.
And it's also important to remember, like, open source for intents is a hobby for a lot of people. So the bar is actually like a little bit lower, and it's just really important to actually just send it in for review and have a look at that work.
Yeah, we've got an issue going around at the moment to do with a change to do with UWP support, and it's bounced around quite a lot because we all have differing opinions to how it should be implemented, and it'll probably bounce around for another week before we get consolidation on it. And nobody's pointing fingers at each other because we're all trying to get to a common goal. We're all trying to improve the basis of the project. So it's really important to have that level of engagement. I would make one point here is that there's some sort of open source documentation out there that basically says everything needs to be done in the open, which I do agree. All decisions should be reflected in pull requests or issues that can be tracked. But the reality is the most productive work you'll get done is on a Slack channel with somebody going, hey, I think this might work. What do you think about this? Da, 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 da. Because you've got that immediacy about it. And that's the thing that stumbles most people in terms of issues and pull requests is, there's a 5-hour lag between, when I code something and when Europe wakes up and goes, no, that's a load of bollocks, right? I don't want that. No, I want it done this way, right? Whereas, if I know that, one of the maintainers is going to be online at the end of my day, I'll pop open Slack and go, hey, what do you think about this? Is it worth me doing a proof of concept around this? And he goes, yeah, no. And I'll go, okay, well, maybe I'll change my idea before I start pushing it out there. Or I literally push it out there and know that he's going to reject it. But it's all good, right? All right, so we want to touch on the fact that no contribution is equal. Now, this isn't a reflection of whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. It's just that the value to the project of different contributions makes a difference, right? And so if you're raising a lot of issues, there's only a small value to the project. It highlights problems. It might reflect a level of interest in certain features. But the most value really comes out of getting commits and pull requests. And I'm isolating the conversation here to just contributions via code, right? There are other things that we've talked about in terms of marketing and design and those types of things that sit outside the code. So this is tailored towards contributions via code. The most valuable ones there are the pull request that gets accepted and moving the project forward, right? Now we talked about the green graph before that freaks me out.
Yeah, so the green graph, okay, so GitHub has two visualizations. It has this graph that shows activity on a day-by-day basis. And there's this notion of chasing the green. Don't chase the green. Don't try and get a perfect commit streak of like green throughout the year. It doesn't end well. Don't do it. But they introduced this new visualization recently, which is like brilliant. It's on point. It actually gives a bit of a shape, and it gives a visualization of like your shape of contribution. Now, it's not perfect because it still has this notion that a contribution is a commit. There are a lot of things you can do to help an open source project that are not commit related. So design work, right? If you spend a couple of months working on a new design for an open source project and then you commit the assets, that's a single contribution, what? So there's a couple of problems with this visualization, this locking a contribution to a commit. But it's really interesting here is like if you find yourself like all the way on the right, just opening issues, well, start thinking about like how you can change that and like set a goal and start seeing if you're moving across to, and you can see getting more involved with the project and see your shape move more across to the left. And if you're an open source maintainer, like look at the shape of someone and go, ooh, this person does a lot of code reviews, but they don't do code reviews in my project. Why is that? Look at it and go, well, maybe there's a problem for a high barrier of contribution. Maybe they need to install a large amount of SDKs to get running. Start that conversation, use it to start a dialogue. It is beautiful. The main thing here is if you want to help out, just use the words, how can I help you? Like, how can I help you? It's the most magical words in open source.
So the final section, we're going to talk about how much to contribute, because this is often a challenge that both individuals and companies face, right? From an individual perspective, hey, I'd love to go and spend hours just hacking away, right? But, you know, I've got other things like work and a family life and whatever to think about. And so it becomes a balance between where I spend my time. And similarly, from a corporate perspective, you know, you're not going to spend, you know, 50, 80% of your time contributing to an open source project, but you might spend 10 or 20% of your developer resources contributing. But how do you define what that balance point is? And more importantly, which projects you're going to contribute to? So I've talked about MVM Cross because I obviously feel that that's got strategic benefit to Built to Roam. But what else should I be contributing to? And you know, is there some general patterns here that we can adopt and actually gives us some guidelines to follow in terms of working out where we should contribute?
Yeah, so there's different levels of contribution. Like we touched on quickly about money, and not many people know this, but we're starting to get to this level of crowdfunding in open source. So there's Patreon, and Patreon funds the creators, but there's now also Open Collective. Open Collective funds projects, and that's a very important distinction because with Open Collective, the revenue goes to a 501c6 nonprofit, and when that money lands in that, it doesn't belong to any one particular person, it belongs to that nonprofit. And if a maintainer needs to get access to that money, they raise an invoice to that nonprofit and it goes through expense claim and approval. And it's really important because it allows for succession. And that money is not in the name of the maintainer, so it's not from a taxation point of view. There are open source projects running on Patreon. I highly suggest you switch across because you get a taxation event for yourself and then you pay someone else, they also get a taxation event. It's not the most efficient system. So a good example of this for money is I was down at Australia Post and I spent $200 on shipping. I was shipping stickers like for the Reactive UI project. This is grassroots marketing. I purchased the stickers from as an expense. And Erin, my wife, she like go, what? You spent $200? You already give so much to open source in this project. And I was like, no, don't worry about it. I'm just going to expense it. And that being able to do that is such a powerful dialogue. Like, and this is some of the things that are just absolutely changing.
And this comes back to some of the softer areas of a project we talked about, is that, you know, quite often us geeks we all like to just get in there and write code. But when you come to actually promoting a project, actually getting more people in on it, you need to start thinking about marketing. You need to think about stickers and all of those types of things that are going to, you know, get people's geek on. But those don't come for free, and unless you've got somebody with those skills actually already contributing to the project, you can't go to a design house and say, hey, I run an open source project, how about you donate some of your time? They'll look at you going, what value does it give me? I mean, because it's mates trading favors with mates. Well, where's the favor in return, right? And so having this financial backing does mean that, you know, if you need to get design work done, so you look at both MVM Cross and Reactive UI, we have nice-ish logos, right? I don't know where they actually came from, but you know, if we had to come up with a new logo or branding, we could actually now pay for those because we have some of this funding. So
yeah, just because like I do spec work doesn't mean everyone else should do spec work. That's not sustainable. So if we want to fix this, we've got to fix it at the core. And on the money aspect, there's a project, Webpack, a small little project. You may not know they're at $400,000 US a year recurring revenue. There is some serious changes happening in our industry. Reactive UI is fortunate enough through company sponsoring and also through our users. We're at $10,000 a year recurring revenue. And we're starting to look at this. Now that you have money, what do you do with it? Right? And the answer to that is we're going to use it to buy services we can't attract to open source projects.
So, I mean, from a business perspective, I mean, someone says, oh, you should financially contribute to this project. And I'm thinking, oh, God, that's going to be like thousands of dollars that I need to contribute. It doesn't, right? It can be whatever you feel is necessary or feels give you value, right? So it could be $100 a year. The important thing is that that's quite a nominal value to any business, right? And if you struggle with that, you've got other problems. But you know, $10 to a project, if you multiply that by the number of people who are using it and contributing to a project, that's a reasonable chunk of money for a project a year, right? So
yeah, it is. We're starting to look at, once we get to this level of, again, doing a website redesign, getting tech writers, well, maybe we can have like a .NET conference for reactive UI. I know MVM Cross had one recently as well.
Yeah. So stepping away from the sort of the financial side of things, the progression from, you know, on contribution level goes roughly user, contributor, maintainer, and this is somewhat imposed by sort of things like GitHub, which basically have different sort of permission levels based on whether you're like just a contributor or whether you've been nominated a maintainer. But from a different note, they also reflect a level of influence on the project. And so what I mean by that is if you look at users, they're just contributing issues, right? Once you start to step into a contributor, then all of a sudden you're contributing fixes and features. And you've got a little bit more control here, right? So you're fixing problems that are there and you're contributing new features potentially. But at this point, you're not really dictating the direction or influencing heavily the direction of the project. As a maintainer, and typically there's a very small subset of contributors that end up being maintainers, and that's for a bunch of reasons. It's not through lack of trying to get more people engaged. It's typically because there are only a finite number of people who are willing to contribute at that level, that they really sway the direction of a particular project. And so that's where we really see that this level of influence varies between different contribution levels. And so from a company perspective, looking at how I protect my supply chain, it's a matter of how much influence do I need to have? And it doesn't need to be actively. I don't need to sway, say MVM and Cross to go and do a particular thing because my customer needs it. But actually, if you start talking to some of the maintainers, they'll go, okay, the reason that this particular feature got done was because my customer needed it. And so there is some self-interest there, and it comes down to the level of influence you have on a project. It's not that they will put the direction of the project to one side and go, hey, I need to go on this wild tangent to do my thing. Normally, it's a matter of prioritization of bugs, and a bug might come up that's really high priority to a particular customer that they're facing. So they'll prioritize that maybe over and above other things. And remember, this is all about mates contributing favors to mates, right? And it happens in the corporate world as well. And at the end of the day, the direction of the project is going to be dictated by the maintainers. They have their own agendas, and that's why it's important to have a community of them which, controls the direction of the project. So, I guess this is sort of our end game for this, it sort of came out at the very last minute that we sort of realized that there's this sort of contribution decision tree, right? And the interesting thing is that we haven't really talked about the first part, is like, can you actually influence a particular project? And so if you look at something like .NET, okay, some of it's now open source. As you as an individual or as a company, how much influence do you really have over .NET? Sure, you can go and raise issues. You can even try and contribute some code. But are you really going to sway the overall direction of it through one issue or even a half a dozen issues, right? You're not really, right? So as a company, am I going to sit there and go, okay, well, I'm going to put a lot of cycles into, trying to sway the direction of .NET? I'm not sure they're going to go back to .NET 4. So that company, not happening, okay? So you need to make that decision first. And, the reality is if you're not if you're not going to influence it, you might as well just be a user of it, right? You could end up being a backer if you feel that there's a lot of people doing good, they're not getting backing from some other corporation. You could definitely be a backer. But the reality is if you're not able to really influence the project, you might as well just consume it. The next one is, do you have capacity to contribute? And that, again, that could be financial, it could be in time. And so the thing is there, if you don't really have capacity to contribute time, you really end up being a backer. I mean, and you know, if you're making use of, say, if I was making use of MVM Cross and I didn't have any capacity to contribute to it, I have a moral obligation to start funding it in some way, shape, or form. And definitely now that as Jeff mentioned, there's this pattern that we can now follow for funding a project without giving it to a particular maintainer and say, hey, go and do what you like with it. We now have a better mechanism for doing that. And this is maturity in the industry, right? This didn't happen like 5 years ago. This really wasn't there, particularly in the .NET space, whereas it now is. Going beyond whether we can contribute, the question is it of strategic importance, right? So, I mean, we use a bunch of open source components. We use JSON.NET, we use MVM Cross, we use all sorts of things. And whilst they all have some value to the project, there is a reality that a lot of them can be chopped and changed with other projects. We made a decision to use this particular JSON library now. We might change and switch over to another one. The reality is we're not going to switch out MVM Cross, right? We could, and we have done on certain other projects. We've used Prism. But the reality is we have a lot of time and cycles invested in knowing and understanding how MVM Cross works. So it wouldn't make sense for us to heavily jump into using Prism on every project, right? And so it does have a strategic value to us, which is why we choose to contribute to it. And the upshot from there is if it's really strategic important to you, you should end up being a maintainer, okay? That's the kind of level you should start to contribute to. Right? If MVM Cross goes off on a wild tangent, it's going to affect my business, right? And so I did make the decision on behalf of my business to basically be a maintainer on that project. And that's not devaluing what impact you can have as a contributor. It's not to say that their opinions are less important. It's just a matter of if you're contributing over time, you'll be able to influence it by bug fixes and features and stuff like that you're working on all the time. So,
yeah. So like in your example here, like Net Standard came along with Windows, and it's Net Standard 2.0 assumes you're running a very new version, the latest version of Windows. And if you need to target an older version of Windows, you need to support Net Standard 1. And as an open source maintainer, I really don't want to do that. Like, and if you come along and say, look, I have the expertise in this domain, I will do that support burden for you so you don't have to. There's no technical reason why we can't support Net Standard down to 1.1 for React UI and other areas. It's just all comes with a cost, and you have to draw the line somewhere. So if someone steps up and says, look, I'll look after that for you so you don't have to worry about it, that's it. So Nick, thank you very much for doing what you did.
Yeah. So I guess at the end, there are a couple of calls to action. Firstly, this session has been around protecting your software supply chain. So from a business perspective, you should start to think about, okay, well, what components am I making use of, and how do I make sure that those components are going to exist going forward? But beyond that, I think that we need to start thinking about sustainability of projects. We shouldn't be just spinning up any willy-nilly project and then just letting it die and wither. Okay, we need to think about is this good for the good of the community? And if it is, how do we make it sustainable? How do we make sure that our maintainers don't burn out? How do we make sure that we have a natural attrition of people coming into the project, using it, moving on, and to make sure that these projects are here and for if they need to be going forward. And so we do feel that this is the start of this conversation, or maybe even we're in the middle of this conversation, but it's something that does need to get a bit more prominence out there, and companies really need to start thinking about what they're contributing back to these projects.
Yeah, and look, we really need people sharing their experiences and their best practices. I was having a conversation with a client of mine who's up from Melbourne, and he had to sit down through multiple layers of engineering, management, HR, and legal to get approval to change employment contracts to even allow his software developers to contribute open source. This is what we're talking about. You actually first have to enable your engineers to contribute open source. Once you've done that, you need to start categorizing what open source you consume, but you don't categorize it from the basis of risk to figure out where your risks are. It's so you've actually got data, so you can actually start going, well, actually, this software, we critically depend upon it. If something was to happen to this software, we would no longer be delivering value to our customers. Instead of delivering value to our customers, and they're paying for us to deliver features, we'd be working on a JSON parser. That's not what our customers pay us for. So start sharing your experiences and your best practices, and It's really important.
I made the point about the financial contribution doesn't have to be huge, but I do remember somebody a quote somewhere that this person was saying, "Oh, it's too complex for my large corporation to contribute such a small amount. I mean, the overhead of the paperwork would negate any contribution." And it's just like, you fundamentally missed the point, okay?
Yeah.
If that's a problem, go and spend 4 hours on a Friday afternoon and contribute some value to the project. I mean, that's what it's really about, right? It's not about your $10 coffee money that you're going to contribute. I mean, seriously. In closing, look, thank you all for attending. Hopefully you're as enthusiastic about this topic as we are. Feel free to connect to us with this outside of here. We're going to hang around for quite a bit, so feel free to come up and share your thoughts. It is an ongoing conversation, and I'd love you guys all to participate with it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.